Okay, we'll give that a shot. Everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Robert. I'll be your host. This is the John F. Kennedy November 1963 Assassination 59th Anniversary Program. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Robert Kelleman. I'm joining you from Dallas, Texas, actually where the assassination took place. And let's go ahead and get started. So the assassination of President Kennedy, one of the most tragic events in American history, also one of the most important events in American history. And in my opinion, people know the basics of the assassination and what took place, but there's really a lot of interesting facets that evolve around this particular event. So what I thought I would do today is kind of walk through some of the events that led up to the assassination, in addition to talking about the assassination itself, of course, and then talk about some of the things that took place afterwards. So kind of an overview of our program is we'll be talking about kind of the historical context of the assassination. We'll be talking about the Kennedy's trip, John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy's trip to Texas. They were in several other places besides Dallas. Of course, we'll talk about the assassination itself, and then we'll talk about some interesting facets of the assassination that took place afterwards. Just as a kind of a quick disclaimer, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I don't think that the Earth is flat, and I don't think that we faked the moon landing or anything like that. So I'm just going to give you the facts as they appear, and you can kind of draw your own conclusions. At the end of our program, I actually have a video that discusses the conspiracy theories. If you want to stick around for that, I think it's like a 4 or 5 minute video kind of talking about that. But throughout our program, I'll kind of stick to the facts, and again, leave it up to you to draw your own conclusions. And everyone, of course, is entitled to their own opinion. All right, let's talk about the historical context of the Kennedys and their trip down to Dallas. So throughout our history, unfortunately, there have been 4 presidential assassinations. Abraham Lincoln was killed in April of 1865. James Garfield was killed in July of 1881. William McKinley was killed in September of 1901, and John F. Kennedy was killed in November of 1963. So there have been 4 presidential assassinations throughout our history. And during a very short time frame in the 1960s, there were 4 very significant assassinations of great American leaders. So John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963. Malcolm X was assassinated in February of 1965. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April of 1968, and Robert Kennedy was assassinated in June of 1968. So very tumultuous time in American history, this 4.5-year span. And the Kennedys are what I consider, and many other people consider, to be the first modern president and first lady. That's really true for a number of reasons. One of them is just the extensive media coverage that the Kennedys received. They really, the president and first lady, of course, have always been very important in the United States, but the media coverage surrounding the Kennedys really went to a whole nother level, and it stayed at that level and increased ever since then. So let's talk a little bit about that. The Kennedys were, of course, numerous magazine covers throughout their time in the public spotlight. And also the rise of the Kennedys coincides with the prominence of television in American society. So you can go back and look at these flashback images of people watching TV in their homes back in the day, and that coincides with the Kennedy presidency. Here's an interesting statistic for you. So in 1950, only 9% of the American households had a television set. By 1960, that had gone up to 87%. So look at this dramatic increase in just a 10-year span, 9% all the way up to 87%. And then, of course, by the time 1963 comes around, it was even a little bit higher than that. So this significance of the television in American society and American history. And if you think about presidents, let's consider John F. Kennedy's 2 predecessors. Can you think of any real kind of like television or video moments kind of centering around Harry Truman or Dwight D. Eisenhower. Truman and Eisenhower were both great presidents, and they accomplished a lot. They were both in office for a significant amount of time. But can you think of really any like video moments that cover their time as president? No, not really, for most of the general public, where that's very, very different for President Kennedy, particularly surprising when you consider the fact that he wasn't in office nearly as long as Truman and Eisenhower. And again, that's the kind of the dawn of the television era. And so if you think about President Kennedy and some of the kind of key, more well-known moments in his life, a lot of people really consider the fact that his televised debate with Richard Nixon led to him being elected in the first place. So there's a big historical debate on the significance of that event. It was very important, but this is a television moment. John F. Kennedy debating Richard Nixon in the series of presidential debates. And then if you go back and think of what's the most well-known inaugural address, I would argue it would probably either be Franklin Roosevelt's fear type of speech that he gave during the Great Depression. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. But then, of course, John F. Kennedy's ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And that's a very famous video recording that most, or at least probably all of us might have seen, but at least most of us have seen. And then Jacqueline Kennedy, she gave her television tour, the White House TV tour. At the time, it was the most watched television program in American history. A lot of people, even to this day, are very familiar with that. And then even the Kennedy assassination, because of the Zapruder film and the television coverage that followed that, was another kind of TV or video moment. And then last but not least, the Kennedy funeral, John F. Kennedy's funeral in Washington, D.C. So there's all these television/video moments of the Kennedy's time in the White House, which is very, very different than the Trumans and Eisenhower. So something to kind of keep in mind. Again, here is that television moment, the Kennedy-Nixon presidential debates from 1960. John F. Kennedy's inauguration. Jackie's White House tour, which took place in February of 1962. And then, of course, the assassination, which the assassination obviously was not broadcast on live television, but because of this Zapruder film and other video footage, it was widely shown afterwards. And most people have seen clips of this film, if not the whole entire thing. And then, of course, Walter Cronkite's famous news coverage of the assassination. We'll actually watch this clip a little bit later. And then the funeral, which was broadcast throughout the world. So all these television moments of the Kennedys. So again, they're really considered the first modern president and first lady, not just for the video and TV stuff, other aspects as well, but that's a significant part of the story. All right, let's talk about the Kennedys' trip to Texas. They weren't just in Dallas. They were in a number of other places. And where were they? Why were they there? What happened, et cetera, et cetera. Let's go over all that stuff. So why were the Kennedys in Dallas to begin with? Let's talk about that. So now President Kennedy is considered one of our great presidents in American history. This is something that's fascinating. This is C-SPAN. Every few years, they survey several dozen historians and have them rank all the United States presidents from high to low. So this was the most recent poll. This was done in 2021. And you can see the president that came out on the top of the ranking was Abraham Lincoln. So the presidential historians consider Lincoln to be our best president. And again, this is people's opinions, but these are historians. And it's not just 3 or 4 or a handful of historians. This is several dozen historians participate in these surveys. You can see Lincoln, Washington, the Roosevelts, Eisenhower, Truman, et cetera. And then you can see here's John F. Kennedy. And they've consistently rated him one of our best presidents. And in the most recent poll, he came in number 8. So he very highly regarded. And John F. Kennedy, in addition to being highly regarded by historians, is also one of our most popular presidents just within the American public. So there's also that dynamic as well. However, if you go back and look at kind of what was going on when John F. Kennedy was alive, a little bit different. So this is the election map of 1960. And this particular election was extremely close. You can see up here in the top right corner, this is the popular vote. And you can see how close it was with his battle with Richard Nixon. So Richard Nixon got 34.1 million votes, and John F. Kennedy got 34.2 million votes. Now, because of the Electoral College, the spread was not quite looking as close. You can see John F. Kennedy got 303 Electoral College votes. Richard Nixon got 219. But what's interesting is the votes in Texas and Illinois were very close. In fact, Kennedy won those two states by a combined 55,000 votes. And there's always been rumors that there were some shenanigans that took place in those two places. To be honest with you, I'm not an expert on that. I haven't really studied that issue, so I can't really speak to that. But the Nixon camps claimed that there was, the Kennedy camp claimed that there wasn't, and people have been debating it ever since. But moving beyond that, if you consider the fact that Kennedy won both Illinois and Texas by a combined 55,000 votes, what that means is if 27,500 people in those two states would have voted for Nixon instead of Kennedy, Richard Nixon would have won the 1960 presidential election instead of John F. Kennedy. And then if you go to the approval rating of John F. Kennedy, now we're in a current period where the two most recent presidents, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, have really struggled with their approval rating, but that has not always been the case. A lot of other previous presidents had extremely high approval ratings. So if you look at John F. Kennedy, look, at one point in time, he had 83% approval rating. And it was pretty high throughout much of his time in office, but it really started to taper off in 1963. Now, in kind of contemporary times, being down in the 60s or even 58, that would be something that a lot of people would be envious of, because we haven't seen numbers like that recently. But that being said, John F. Kennedy was a little bit above 50% in terms of popularity at this point in time. So there was a real question of whether or not he was going to be reelected in 1964. And so Kennedy's aware of this, so was his team, and they start a year before the election to kind of informally kick off that process. And thus they end up talking about, hey, John F. Kennedy or Jack Kennedy running for re-election in November of 1964. So at the time of the assassination, the election of 1964 was less than a year away, and Texas was a very important state. If you remember back to the map that we saw, you can see Kennedy won Texas, but it was very close. And so this is going to be a very important battleground for him. And it's decided that Texas will be kind of the official kickoff of the 1964 re-election campaign. Another factor to consider is what you'd call the Jackie factor. Jacqueline Kennedy, she was a very popular first lady. I don't have her approval ratings, but it was extremely high. She was very well liked by the public. She drew a lot of media attention wherever she went. And so the thought was she would accompany President Kennedy down to Texas. And here's a picture of President and Mrs. Kennedy exiting church. Here is a picture of the two of them on one of their state visits. And so she's very popular. Now, the reason why this is somewhat interesting for the Texas trip is because Mrs. Kennedy had been out of the spotlight for several weeks prior to going to Texas. And why was that? Well, it's not an unknown part of the story, but it's one aspect that there's a lot of people that aren't familiar with this part of the story. So 15 weeks prior to the death of President Kennedy, they lost their son, Patrick. He was born on August 9th, and these are the headlines. And this is not an unknown part of the Kennedy story, but a lot of people aren't familiar with this aspect. So I wanted to include this. So unfortunately, their son died 39 hours after he was born, their son Patrick. And this is a really interesting case. There's this when you think about Jacqueline Kennedy, one of the things she's known for is the poise that she showed after the death of her husband. When you consider the fact that 15 weeks prior to losing her husband, she also lost her son Patrick. It really makes her poise during the time after the death of her husband even more impressive, so to speak. But anyways, after the death of Patrick, Mrs. Kennedy had some extreme health issues herself, and she was no doubt mourning and grieving. And so she had really been out of the public spotlight since this had taken place. And so the fact that she's going to go on this trip with her husband was really an interesting point, just because she had been out of the public eye for several weeks, but because she was so popular, because they're kicking off the campaign, and this is an important milestone, so to speak, it's thought that it would be great if Jacqueline could accompany her husband, President Kennedy, down to Texas, and so she agrees to do so. So the Texas trip was really the unofficial kickoff to the 1964 re-election campaign, and also the fact that Jacqueline was going to participate was also an interesting and exciting aspect of the trip, given the fact that it was just 15 weeks after the death of their son, Patrick. Now, this is a photo that I've always thought was really interesting. This is actually the kind of last official photo that was taken of the Kennedys during their last night together at the White House. So on Wednesday, November 20th, the Kennedys had a small Christmas or holiday reception at the White House where they unveiled the family Christmas tree, and they had some friends and family members over. And so here's President Kennedy and First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy standing in front of the tree. And so this is their last night together at the White House in Washington, D.C., Wednesday, November 20th, 1963. And this is kind of like the last official picture taken of the two of them. And then after the reception, the Kennedys went upstairs to the private residence section of the White House. And if you're old enough to remember back in the day when people used to fill out handwritten Christmas cards and mail them off, that was a big aspect of most people's lives. And particularly if you're president and first lady, you have a lot of Christmas cards to mail out. And so it was decided that the Kennedys should get a head start because they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these cards that they're going to have to sign. So they spent their last night together also beginning the process of signing these Christmas cards. Now, of course, these were never actually mailed because 2 days later, tragedy struck. Now, the trip to Texas involved a lot more than just going to Dallas. So the Kennedys were scheduled to leave Washington, D.C. on Thursday morning. They're going to go to San Antonio, then they're going to go to Houston, and then they're going to go to Fort Worth. So it's a real whirlwind type of trip. And then on Friday, they're going to leave Fort Worth, go to Dallas, then they'll go on to Austin, and then they'll close things out at the Lyndon Johnson Ranch in the Texas Hill Country, and then they'll fly home on Saturday. So it's kind of like a quick whirlwind tour of Texas, going to these 6 different places. And if you're not familiar with the Texas geography, here's a quick Lone Star geographic lesson for you. So they're going to fly in from Washington, D.C. They're going to land in San Antonio. They're going to be there for a few hours. Then they're going to go to Houston, fly there. They're going to be there for a few hours. Then they're going to fly up to Fort Worth. They'll spend the night there. President Kennedy will give a speech in the morning. Then they'll go to Dallas. And then after Dallas, they'll go to Austin and then to the Lyndon Johnson Ranch. Now, of course, they didn't make these last 2 stops on the trip because of the tragedy that took place. But anyway, that's the historical context of the trip. And here's actually a photo of the Kennedys leaving the Washington, D.C. area. The president and first lady and their touring party flew out of Andrews Air Force Base. And so this is Thursday morning, the day before the assassination. And here's a picture of the 2 of them getting ready to board Air Force One. And so this is the last official photo of the Kennedys taking in the Washington, D.C. area. And interestingly enough, Jackie's looking at the camera, President Kennedy looking straight ahead, carrying his top hat. And off they go to San Antonio. So let's talk about some of these other places that they went before Dallas, because this is a part of the story that's not really all that well known. I think maybe some people just know about or are familiar with the Dallas part of the trip, but let's talk about some of these other places. So they begin things in San Antonio, and here's the crowd lined up at the airport, San Antonio International Airport. Here's the presidential limousine. Look at all these people up here, hoping to catch a glimpse of the president and first lady. And here they are departing off the plane. You can see President Kennedy holding his top hat. Here's Jackie alongside of him as they exit down the stairs. And that's, of course, Air Force One. And then this is a famous photo. I see this image used frequently in different media contexts. Sometimes, though, I don't see a description of what the photo is. So if you've seen this photo before, but didn't know what the story was behind it, this is President and Mrs. Kennedy after they've exited the airplane, Air Force One, in San Antonio the day before the assassination. And there's a close-up look at the big smiles on their faces. And then they're walking from the plane to the motorcade. Jackie wearing gloves. And look at the beautiful day, nice and sunny. And again, perhaps you've seen some of these photos before, but just didn't know the context behind them. Look at those big smiles from President and Mrs. Kennedy as they greeting the crowd. And again, this is just one day before the assassination. This is less than 24 hours before the assassination. And here they are getting in the car. And everything just looks so pleasant and carefree in these photos. It's very eerie to look at these, knowing what's going to take place the following day. So then this is the presidential motorcade passing through the streets of San Antonio. This is an elementary school. And so they published the route that the motorcade was going to be taking. And so you can see the children have gotten out of school and they're standing outside so they can see the president and first lady waving to them. Notice that the seating arrangement, if you're familiar with the seating arrangement of the actual assassination, in this particular photo, it's a little bit different than it was later. You have this guy up here on the back of his truck waving. That's pretty cool. There's actually a historical marker in San Antonio that points out this spot where the Kennedys actually passed by. And then this is interesting. This gentleman here, this photo is from a few years ago, but this gentleman here, he's pointing out to his family where he is in the photo. So if you're in San Antonio, you should go check this out. You can go see it in person. And they published the route of the motorcade in the newspaper. Now, I've heard people talk about the fact that they published the route the Kennedy motorcade took in Dallas. And some people may think that, oh, that was strange or unusual or unsafe. But, you know, it was a different era back then. And that was just something that they did. So I wanted to show you the fact that they had also done the same thing in San Antonio. It was just, that was part of the deal. That's how people knew where to go to see the president, because this had been publicized. And so here's the presidential motorcade route in San Antonio. So he flew into San Antonio International Airport, and then he was going to give a speech at Kelly Air Force Base, and then he was going to fly out from Brooks Air Force Base. There's always a lot of logistics that take place in the presidential travels. And again, just a really interesting photo. And then here they are passing through the streets of downtown San Antonio. So if you're kind of a little bit familiar with the Dallas motorcade, that was just something that they had done back then. Again, it was a very different era. And so here's the motorcade passing through the streets of San Antonio. Marty points out San Antonio and Houston were very democratic back then. Fort Worth and Dallas, very Republican. Thanks, Marty. I appreciate that. Do you have any questions or comments? And if you're watching this live, feel free to share those in the Zoom chat or the Zoom Q&A. Thanks, Marty. Greatly appreciate that. Look at all these people lining the streets. And here's the motorcade passing through. Look at how close these people are to President Kennedy. If you think about the shot that Oswald took, I hate to say it, if someone wanted to shoot President Kennedy, they just could have been standing in this crowd and walked up to the car and shot him. But again, a very, very different era back then than we're in now. And again, just look at all these people lining the streets. You even have people sitting and standing on the buildings up here. So I don't know, to me, it's just really fascinating to look at these pictures of the prior trip locales in Texas before they went off to Dallas. And then President Kennedy went to San Antonio, among other things, to deliver a speech. So here he is. And of course, here's Jackie. And then Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, he was from Texas, of course. And so they're enjoying it. They had beautiful weather this particular day. Just so you know, he's not holding his light blue iPhone here. They're holding the program. And so this was the dedication speech of the Brooks Aerospace Medical Division. And you can find excerpts of this speech on YouTube. I was tempted to play an excerpt, but due to the time limitations, I decided to pass on that. But if you want to hear President Kennedy's speech, you can find it in different locations on the internet. And then the motorcade left there. And they left San Antonio. And then here was some of the press coverage they received. Thousands give JFK rousing San Antonio welcome. So you can see some of the press coverage from there. And then it was off to Houston. So this is the same day. Remember, they left Washington, D.C. Thursday morning. They arrived in San Antonio. They were there for a while, then they went off to Houston. And here they are exiting the plane there. You can tell the time difference. If you look at the pictures of the Kennedys for this particular day, you can kind of tell the ones where they're departing the plane in San Antonio versus Houston, because the Houston ones, it's getting later in the day. So you can see the sunset is coming in. And here they are getting off the plane. And again, this is in Houston. There's Jackie receiving some beautiful yellow roses, which is a very symbolic flower in the state of Texas. And it's just so sad and eerie just to look at the smiles and the welcome they received in these photos, knowing what's going to be taking place the next day. Very tragic. And then again, you can see the sun setting. Crowd of people to greet them. More crowds. And then look at these big smiles on President and Mrs. Kennedy. Really like this photo a lot. Let's zoom in on it. There they are, beaming from ear to ear, just really pleased with the reception that they've received. And again, remember, Jackie just lost her son 15 weeks earlier. This is really the first time that she's been out in the public spotlight, and the weather was nice and warm and sunny and beautiful. Again, they're going down to kind of unofficially kick off the 1964 re-election campaign. So this must have been a very welcoming time for them, and getting this reassurance from the crowd and the people cheering and applauding. And then it's time to get down to official business and get in the car, and off they go. And here they are driving through the streets of Houston. This is funny. Look at all these people stuck in traffic over here on this side. And then again, notice all these people lining the street here. They have the presidential motorcade with the local police and Secret Service, and then members of the press following as well. This is interesting. I didn't take these photos myself, but some people take historic photos and they line them up with a scene from current times, just so you can see how things fit in. So this is a famous photo of the motorcade passing through the streets of Houston, and someone held it up to the Houston street scene in current times, so you can see how things are similar. And then here's another famous photo. This is people waiting for the motorcade to pass through the streets of downtown Houston, and they have it lined up with a more contemporary view. And then a really interesting speech was given in Houston by Jacqueline Kennedy. She spoke a number of different languages, including Spanish. And so she delivered a short speech in Spanish. And again, I was really tempted to play it for you, but if I did that, our program would have, if I played every single interesting video that I knew of, this program would go on for 3 or 4 hours. So to kind of keep it a little bit under control, I kind of skipped some things. But if you're interested in hearing it, just Google it, or you can look it up on YouTube. Just type like Jacqueline Kennedy Houston speech or something like that. And so she delivered some remarks. And then, of course, President Kennedy also delivered some remarks, the photo of them greeting the crowd. And then eventually it's time to bid farewell to Houston and go off to Fort Worth, where they're going to spend the night. So the Kennedys arrive in Fort Worth late on Thursday night. They're going to spend the night there, and then Friday morning continue on with the trip and the planned activities. And this is where they stayed at in Fort Worth. This is a very famous building in Fort Worth. It used to be called the Hotel Texas. It's now the Fort Worth Hilton, but this is one of the nicest hotels in Texas. It was one of the nicest hotels in Texas at this point in time too. Here's an advertisement for it, you can see. And here's a more contemporary view. So this is the spot or the place where John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy spent their last night together in Fort Worth, Texas. And some people don't know this part of the story and how it fits in with the Kennedy history. And if you're interested, you can actually rent out the presidential suite. It's available. I don't know what the cost is. I'm sure it's pretty expensive. It's room 1530. And here's some pictures of it just to give you a sense of what it looks like inside. So if you can't afford to rent the presidential suite at this hotel, at least you have some pictures so you can get a sense of what it will look like. So again, this is where John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy spent their last night together in Fort Worth. There was a local group that took artwork from private collections, and including a painting by Vincent van Gogh, and hung them on the walls of the suite. So it was kind of like there was almost like this mini art exhibit that they had in the hotel room to kind of show them some Texas hospitality. And then a few years ago, the Dallas Museum of Art had a special exhibit on the artwork that was displayed in the Kennedy's suite in Fort Worth. So that was interesting. You can Google that if you want to learn more about that. Again, just for the sake of time, we have to kind of skip through that. But here's a picture of the Texas Hotel back in the day. The hotel now is a little bit different. Back then, it had this very flat parking lot. If you have been to Fort Worth or you're in Fort Worth, been there recently, it doesn't quite exactly look like this anymore. Excuse me, just one second. This has been built up. But the morning of the assassination, President Kennedy was scheduled to deliver a speech at the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce that was meeting here at the hotel. Here's a picture of President Kennedy coming outside. So he heard there were all these people waiting outside to hopefully get a chance to see him and Jackie. And so it was decided that he would come out and give kind of like an impromptu speech to the people that were standing outside, which I think they estimate the crowd to be between 2,000 and 3,000 people. So here's President Kennedy and some other members of the dignitaries and Secret Service, etc., coming out of the hotel. If you haven't been to Fort Worth, Texas, their slogan is "Where the West Begins." And here's President Kennedy. And again, there was a big crowd to greet him, which was surprising because the weather was actually pretty poor at this particular time. It had been drizzling all morning. You can see people with the umbrellas. And that's historically significant because it had the rain continued later into the day. When they were going through Dallas, of course, they wouldn't have had the top down on the convertible, and history would have turned out very differently. But it had been drizzling all morning, and then all of a sudden the rain stopped, and President Kennedy thought that would be a good opportunity to go out and see all these people that have been waiting in the rain to hopefully catch a glimpse of him. And so he delivered a few short remarks. This is another speech. You can find this in various places on the internet if you want to read it. It's a nice speech he gave here. He was delivering his remarks. He's standing in front of Governor Connolly and Lyndon Johnson. And then this gives you kind of a sense of the crowd in the background. So they estimate the number of people here between 2,000 and 3,000 people standing outside, hoping to get a glimpse of him and or Jackie. And then look at all these people. So again, a lot of people make note of the fact that, you know, President Kennedy's driving through the streets of downtown Dallas in this convertible and what an easy target he was. But I mean, look at this photo. If someone wanted to do something to him, they could have easily just walked up to him and done something. Fortunately, that did not happen, but it was just a very, very different era back then than it is now, and particularly in light of what was to happen later in the day. But when you look at this photo, and just see all these people, and yeah, there's Secret Service around, but there's still lots and lots of people coming out to greet the president. And then if you go to Fort Worth now, if you get a chance, you should really check this out. They have this John F. Kennedy Tribute Memorial. So this is actually outside the hotel. There's a nice statue here. They have all these pictures of the Kennedy's time there. They have excerpts from his speech and information about the time that he spent in Fort Worth. And so this is right downtown. So if you're in Fort Worth or the Fort Worth area or going to be visiting, make sure you check this out. Here's another view. Oh, here's another comment from our friend Marty. She says, Texas Democrats needed the Kennedys to shore up Texas support for the 1964 election. Lyndon Johnson was embroiled in a voting scandal, and many Texans, although Democratic leaning, neither liked nor trusted LBJ. Fort Worth's Kimball Art Museum arranged for several of Jackie's favorite Impressionist paintings to be hung on the walls of their hotel room. Thanks, Marty. Appreciate that. Again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to share those in the chat or the Q&A. It's another view of the memorial. So this is called the John F. Kennedy Tribute Memorial in Fort Worth. On the evening of November 21st, 1963, President and Mrs. John F. Kennedy arrived in Fort Worth to spend the night at the Hotel Texas. Early the next morning, President Kennedy made an unscheduled outdoor appearance and surprised a crowd that had gathered here hoping to see him. At breakfast in the hotel, he spoke to 3,000 people emphasizing Fort Worth's role in defense and aircraft production. So that was one reason why he came here. Fort Worth had a lot of manufacturing that was really important in the national defense. Remember, this is the height of the Cold War. And then I'll let you kind of continue and read that. So let's see, he accepted with good humor the city's traditional welcome gift of a locally made Shady Oaks Western hat. The president's trip around Texas, though billed as non-political, was surely brought about by infighting among Texas Democrats, as Marty pointed out. Following breakfast on November 22nd, 1963, the president and his entourage left the Hotel Texas in a motorcade to Carswell Air Force Base for a short flight to Dallas. On the drive to luncheon speech in Dallas, President Kennedy was assassinated, bringing shock and grief to Texas, the nation, and the world. So this is the historical marker that's in that memorial I was just showing you. And so here's President Kennedy delivering his remarks at the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce inside the hotel. So this is the last speech that he ever gave. Here's President Kennedy. Here's the sign of the Chamber of Commerce. And then if you look over here, you can see here's Jackie and here's Lyndon Johnson. And then this is the last segment of the speech that President Kennedy gave. And so he said, "I am confident as I look to the future that our chances for security, our chances for peace are better than they have been in the past. And the reason is because we are stronger. And with that strength is a determination to not only maintain the peace, but also the vital interests of the United States. To that great cause, Texas and the United States are committed. Thank you." And so those were the last words of the last speech that John F. Kennedy ever gave, and that was in Fort Worth, Texas, just a few hours before he was killed. And then there's Jackie with her famous pink suit, talking to, this is Lyndon Johnson, of course. She's a little bit cropped out of the picture, but this is Lady Bird Johnson. And then here's John F. Kennedy, of course, over here. And then the Kennedys are going to depart the hotel and go off to Dallas. And so here's Jackie walking out of the Hotel Texas. And then here's that sign again, "Welcome to Fort Worth, where the West begins." Here's President Kennedy walking out the door. Here's Jackie getting in the car with her pink suit. And then here they are traveling through the streets of Fort Worth. So this is like the main downtown area in Fort Worth. And again, look at all of these people that have come out to see the Kennedys. Just a really enormous crowd here as they pass through the streets of the city. And then I have a short video that I thought I would play that kind of captures the Kennedys' time in Fort Worth. Let me, oops, hold on. I broke something on my computer. Let me get this queued up here. So very touching watching that film footage of the Kennedys passing through Fort Worth. And then this is a touching photo. So this is President Kennedy waving goodbye to the crowds in Fort Worth at the Air Force Base. Now, the Kennedys took a plane, they took Air Force One from Fort Worth to Dallas, which is not very far away. And you might be wondering, God, if you're familiar with the geography of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, you might be wondering, God, why would they do that? It's really not that far of a drive from Fort Worth to Dallas. But the reason why they took the plane, it wasn't just the fact that they had to go to Fort Worth to Dallas, but remember, after Dallas, they also have to go to Austin. And so, yeah, it is not very far to travel from Fort Worth to Dallas, but they didn't want to have to drive back from Dallas to Fort Worth and then fly to Austin from there. So it was thought that, hey, let's just fly from Fort Worth to Dallas. Then when President Kennedy's done in Dallas, he can get back to Love Field and get on the plane and then just immediately go fly down to Austin, as opposed to having to drive back to Fort Worth. So I know some people kind of might be wondering like why they took the plane from Fort Worth to Dallas, but you kind of had to think about the whole trip, not just this kind of one segment. But again, kind of a very eerie, sad photo of President Kennedy waving goodbye to the crowd at the Air Force Base in Fort Worth. All right, let's talk about the assassination. We have kind of enough of the historical context. So, of course, this event took place on Friday, November 22nd in 1963, 59 years ago today. Next year will be a big milestone, 60th anniversary. And I thought what I would do is put a timeline together so you can kind of make sense of how all these events unfolded. So at 11:38 in the morning, Air Force One land at Love Field. And then they were there for about 14 minutes. And then the presidential motorcade departed. And 38 minutes after that, President Kennedy was shot. I'll fill in the timeline with some other noteworthy aspects of the day's events a little bit later. And here's the crowd that is greeting the arrival of President Kennedy. Beverly pointed out the music in the video that we just saw is very ominous. Yeah, I would agree with you, Beverly. That's very true. Look at all these cheering fans and supporters and members of the general public coming out to greet the Kennedys at Dallas Love Field. Here was the newspaper visit that was talking about the fact that the Kennedys had been in San Antonio. Storm of political controversy swirls around Kennedy on visit. And then here's a map on the front page of the Dallas Morning News showing the route of the presidential motorcade. So here's the headline. Remember, there's that photo images we saw earlier, and then here's the map. And so again, you might be wondering, like, why would they do that? Well, they wanted people to come out and see the president and first lady. That was kind of one of the points of the trip. And so if they didn't publish the route, how would anyone know that they were going to be passing through? So that's the story behind that. Now, not everyone in Texas was a fan of President Kennedy. So these leaflets had been handed out saying President Kennedy was wanted for treason, and there were these protesters, Yankee go home, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I kind of talked about earlier the fact that President Kennedy, even though now he's considered one of our best presidents, he's one of our most popular presidents, he did win the 1960 election very, very closely, and his approval rating had been deteriorating. So things were a little bit different back in 1960s than they are now. And then look at this beautiful photo of Jacqueline Kennedy and John F. Kennedy exiting Air Force One at Love Field in Dallas. And Jackie with her famous pink suit. And here they are getting greeted by dignitaries. And again, the weather was very beautiful. So the weather really played an important part in the day's event. So the last 2 days, I was actually down at Dealey Plaza and the John F. Kennedy Memorial. And the weather in Dallas this past weekend, extremely cold. It was 37 degrees yesterday at 9 o'clock in the morning, and it was 38 degrees at 9 o'clock in the morning today. So if it had been that cold back then, or if it had been raining, remember in Fort Worth, it was initially raining in the morning, they wouldn't have been driving with the top down, the convertible. And history would have turned out very differently. The Weather Channel has a really fascinating series where they describe historical events that were impacted by the weather. But you can see by this point in time, the sun has come out, it's warming up, and the weather is really perfect at this point in time for late November in Dallas. And then here's Jacqueline Kennedy holding a bouquet of red roses. And she said later, every time we got off the plane that day, she means the trip, not necessarily this day, but every time we got off the plane that day, 3 times, meaning in San Antonio and Houston and Fort Worth, they gave me the yellow roses of Texas. But in Dallas, they gave me red roses. I thought, how funny, red roses. So all the seat, meaning the seat, the car that President Kennedy was killed in, was full of blood and red roses. The reason why they didn't have any yellow roses to give her is because they had so many events going on related to the Kennedys' arrival in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The flower suppliers ran out of yellow roses because remember, they were in Fort Worth, and then President Kennedy's going to be speaking at the Trade Mart, and there's all these other kind of related events. So whoever was in charge of giving her the roses at the airport, they didn't have any more yellow roses available, so they gave her red roses, ironically enough. And then here's Jackie's famous suit. I thought I would take a moment and talk about this just because it's so well known. Pink Chanel suit made of wool. The double-breasted raspberry pink and navy trim-colored suit was matched with a trademark matching pink pillbox hat and white gloves. In the early 1960s, the Chanel suit was a wardrobe staple of the upwardly mobile American female. It evoked a powerful image of a sophisticated, intelligent, and independent modern woman, kind of like Jacqueline Kennedy herself. And it could fit almost every daytime occasion that required a woman to dress stylishly. Given that the Chanel suit was a strong statement of an independent woman, it is balanced by the color pink, which has an element of traditional femininity. Most of the American public viewing pictures of the presidential couple on television and in newspapers would not have known the color of the suit at that point in time, given that at the time, TV news and newspapers were in black and white. The color of the suit did not become widely known until the publication of color photos in Life magazine's JFK Memorial issue on November 29th, 1963, so 7 days afterwards. Eventually, the suit, which was never clean, was given to the National Archives. It will not be seen by the public until at least 2103. That's a little bit controversial, the decision not to show the suit. Part of the reason for that is the request of the Kennedy family. But if you think about it, what are some of the most iconic clothing items in American history? You'd have to think that this suit is definitely one of those items. Now, Jacqueline had worn this pink Chanel suit a few times before. This is her the previous year where she was in a press type event talking about the restoration of Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. So this is not a photo from Dallas. This is photo from several months before where she's at this historic preservation event, so to speak. And then this is a European fashion advertisement that actually has the suit on it. So this was from before Jackie wore it. And you can see here it is here with kind of some other similar styles from back in the day. And again, those big smiles as they get off the plane. Now, the suit has become so iconic. Imagine if she had been wearing this when President Kennedy was assassinated. Perhaps this would be a very famous outfit for her. So just really kind of interesting how the pink Chanel suit is so closely associated with the assassination. And there they are getting greeted. And again, the big smiles. So again, look at the crowd. I had to actually put arrows in here to show you where the Kennedys are. So this pink arrow, look, you can see Jackie down here. And then the blue arrow, you can see President Kennedy here. So this is a fence, but there were all these people lined up. And so the two of them decided to go up to the people that were standing behind the fence to greet them and shake their hands and chat with them and stuff. So again, just a really big turnout. People. And some more photos, these ones in black and white. And here they are greeting the crowd. And again, it would have been very easy to someone to do something if they wanted to right here, among other places. Now, I thought I would do this. You know, you have to kind of think back of what the era was like back then for the media. So this is before CNN and the internet and the 24-hour news cycle, and et cetera. But they were broadcasting the Kennedy's arrival at the airport and the various other activities kind of centered around their trip on the radio. So I'm going to play a video. It does have a video that accompanies it, but it wasn't the video that like would have been streaming on TV. So as you're listening to this, kind of pretend, let's go back in time, that you're somewhere in Dallas and you're listening to the radio because they didn't have, you know, live television coverage of the trip back then. So it's kind of pretend you're listening to this on the radio. But someone was nice enough to take the audio recording from the radio and line it up with video. So we're going to play this and you can kind of get a sense of what it would have been like to see or listen to the Kennedys' arrival at Love Field.
As Mrs. Kennedy and the crowd yells, "And the President of the United States." And I can see his suntan all the way from here. Shaking hands now with the Dallas people, Governor and Mrs. Conley. Governor Conley on your left. Governor Conley with his arm around the President. Kennedy backs up and waits for the President, who stopped to chat with some of the people greeting him here. Crowd waving, as you can see. People standing up all over everything available to get a glimpse of the President and his wife. Cheering and yelling going on down the way as they approach the cars. Secret Service right along with the President, of course. The President passes right in front of a Dallas police officer, right in front of our cameras now. Somebody patted his shoulder. Mrs. Kennedy coming along behind him, grinning all the while. President saying, "Thank you very much. If I may be permitted to read a presidential lip movement." This is a bonus for the people who have waited out here. And the President waves goodbye, waits for his wife, and back they go to the car. Governor Conley standing in the car with a big 10-gallon hat on. Mrs. Kennedy stepping in the car first. Now the President. They both in the back seat now. Now the motorcade will very shortly start to move out. The President's car moving out. The President and First Lady. big, beautiful Lincoln, followed by Secret Service men, the car behind. Then comes the Vice President and Mrs. Johnson, Senator Yarborough. Dallas police out here in force today, doing a beautiful job of handling the crowd, along with a contingent of Texas Rangers. The party now is leaving Dallas Love Field. And, of course, as we say, thousands will be on hand for that motorcade now, which will be downtown Dallas, down Cedar Springs, to Harwood, and on Harwood it'll turn on Main, from which point it'll go all the way down to the courthouse area, which is the end of Main. It'll turn on Houston Street to Elm under the Triple Underpass, out to the march where the president talks at approximately 1 o'clock.
So that was a local radio announcer that was describing the events of the day. Now, President Kennedy, after he left Love Field, the plan was for the motorcade to pass around various parts of Dallas, including downtown Dallas. And then he was going to go to a place called the Trade Mart, and he was going to deliver a speech there. And then here's a picture of the inside of the Trade Mart. So they have everything set up for lunch. So the president will deliver a speech here to the audience, of course, which he was not able to do so. And then after the Trade Mart, the plan was to go back to Love Field, fly down to Austin, where the president was going to deliver a speech at the Convention Center and Municipal Auditorium in Austin, which of course did not happen. And then from there, the plan was to go on Friday evening to the Lyndon Johnson Ranch, which is open to the public. You can actually visit this site. It's really fascinating. And then they were going to fly home or back to Washington on Saturday. But of course, those portions of the trip did not take place. All right, let's talk about the motorcade. So here they are in the car at the airport. You can see here's President Kennedy. Here's Jacqueline Kennedy. Remember, the seating arrangement was a little bit different than we saw in San Antonio. And then notice here's the roses that we referred to earlier. Now, this car had different configurations. This was a Lincoln Continental, specially designed to be the president's vehicle. So it was a hardtop. Here is the hardtop section of it. It could also be used as what they called a bubble top. So this would be glass, would allow the president to see out, but provide a little bit of protection. And then also, of course, it could be used as a convertible, which is what decided to do. So again, if the weather had been different, if it had been colder like it was this weekend, or raining like it had been doing earlier in the day, they would have either gone with the hard top or with the bubble top. But because the sun came out and it warmed up, they ended up going with the convertible. Now, you might think that, oh, really interesting that they would ride around in a convertible, but no, not really, because that was something that they had done on a regular basis throughout their time. So this is a cute photo of John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy. He's admiring her hair. They're smiling at one another. And then this was a campaign parade. This was a parade that they were in as like a campaign event. So, the Kennedys, let's face it, they're very good looking. Convertibles were a popular style of car back then. And so it just kind of made sense for those two of them to match up. And here's another campaign event, John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy. This was when he was running for president. And then here they are in a stadium in a car. Here's a ticker tape parade. Here's another parade. And then this is actually just a few weeks before the assassination. You might recognize this photo. This is John F. Kennedy actually going through the streets of downtown Washington, D.C. On the way from Union Station to the White House. So again, this kind of motorcade thing, while it may seem unusual now because presidents don't do this anymore, this was something that was just very common back at that point in time in history, and not just even in the United States. This is a photo of Jacqueline Kennedy, and this is a trip that she took to India. And so this is her passing through the streets of India in a convertible. President Kennedy did not accompany Jacqueline on this particular trip. She went with her sister. And then here's the president passing through the streets of Mexico. And then here they are in Ireland. So again, this was just kind of somewhat of a common thing back then. So Dallas was really not all that unique in terms of the president passing through the streets for people to see and greet him, and vice versa. And so this is the early part of the motorcade. And again, look at all these people lined up. And a lot of people have kind of wondered why Oswald chose to shoot President Kennedy from the book depository as opposed to just standing out in the street. You probably would have to think that he did that because he thought he could get away easier. So if you would have shot him in a spot like this, he would have immediately been apprehended. So one theory, although there's numerous questions right around the assassination, of course. And again, here they are passing through the streets of Dallas. Again, look at the beautiful day with the sun, and it's warm out and these big crowds. And then so some of the cars are local police, some of the cars are Secret Service, and then some of the cars are members of the press and other dignitaries like Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson. And then here's a famous photo of the motorcade. Again, note the people alongside the street. And here's where the tragedy took place. So this is the book depository. It's called that because this building was used by the Dallas School District to store books that were going to be distributed to the students. So this is Friday, November 22nd, 1963, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see here is where the events start taking place. 3 bullets are fired. And so here's where Oswald is. And here's where the bullets come down. I'll show you some other views of that in a minute. So this is the scene, the building in more recent times. Here's the window that Oswald looked out of. The motorcade came down this street towards the building, and then it made a left turn right here. And then that's where things took place. Here's another view. This is actually the view that Oswald had. So the presidential motorcade came down this street, turned right, came down through here, made a left turn, and then these trees were there back then, but they were much smaller, so his view would have not have been obstructed. And this is where things took place. Another picture. And then here's another view from the opposite direction. So the motorcade came down through here, it turned right, came down through here, turned left, and then these where the shots came. And you can visit this site today. It looks pretty much exactly the way it did for the most part, to the way it did back then, with the exception of the fact that the trees are a little bit taller now than they were back then. And then here's another view. Here's the window of the book depository. Here's that famous photo of the Kennedys. And this is a photo taken just moments before the assassination. You can see here the Secret Service standing on the side rail of the car following President and Mrs. Kennedy. And then here's the local police officers and their motorcycles. Here's a view from the other direction. And then this photo, actually a woman that was standing opposite of the book depository took this photo. And you can see President Kennedy has already been shot here because he's lurching over to the left as Jackie's looking towards him to kind of see what's going on. This is the infamous grassy knoll up here. And then again, we talked about the fact that the Kennedys' first modern president and first lady, everyone has, for the most part, usually seen the Zapruder film. It's just so well known. So imagine how our memory or our kind of conceptualization of this event would be different if it weren't for the fact that this video footage was taken by Abraham Zapruder. So here's a photo of him. His name is very famous, and because it's closely associated because of the film. Here's the camera. The Zapruder film is a silent 8mm color motion picture sequence shot by Abraham Zapruder with a Bell and Howell home movie camera as United States President John F. Kennedy's motorcade passed through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. Unexpectedly, it ended up capturing the president's assassination. Even though it is not the only film of the shooting, the Zapruder film is considered to be the most complete one, giving a relatively clear view from a somewhat elevated position on the side from which the president's fatal head wound is visible. It was an important part of the Warren Commission hearings and all subsequent investigations of the assassination, and it is one of the most studied pieces of film in history. Can you think of any other films that have been studied as much as the Zapruder film? Here's an advertisement for the camera that he was using, Bell and Howell. And here is the camera. It's in the possession of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And so you can go see it if you visit their museum, which is actually not very far from the White House. And we talked about here was the path the motorcade took. And then it turned left. And then here's the book depository. And so here's where Mr. Zapruder was standing, right here. So his video captured things. Now there was a sign right here which obscured part of the video, ironically enough. And then here's some clips from the video. Now, I was really debating whether or not to show the video. I didn't for a couple of reasons. Number one, I feel like a lot of people have already seen it. Number one, and number two is widely available on the internet. And so if you do want to see I thought we'd spend our time talking about and showing other things. It's also pretty graphic. And so kind of out of respect, I chose not to show it for that reason, but I don't want to make anyone upset. If you do want to see it, it's very easy to find. It would take 5 seconds to go to YouTube, type Kennedy Zapruder film, and all different versions that will pop up. Now, I wanted to play, though, a video that kind of talks about the history of the Zapruder film. I actually thought this was interesting. So let's go ahead and cue this up. And again, thanks so much for joining us this evening.
On November 22, 1963, Abraham Zapruder filmed what has been called the most important home movie in history. Zapruder owned an apparel company for women across the street from the Texas Schoolbook Depository. At 12:30 p.m., he stood at this spot in Dealey Plaza as the JFK motorcade approached. He filmed the entire procession without stopping for 26 seconds. 3 shots rang out. Dallas Morning News reporter Harry McCormick was the first journalist to encounter Zapruder. McCormick later wrote that Zapruder was obviously highly agitated, almost weeping. McCormick told Zapruder that he might be able to have the film processed at the Dallas Morning News, but no one at the news could process the 8mm film, so they went next door to the studios of WFAA-TV. They couldn't process the film either. But Zapruder agreed to a live on-camera interview with Channel 8.
And I saw his head practically open up, all blood and everything, and I kept on shooting. That's about all. I'm just sick.
They found a Kodak lab near Love Field that could process the film. Escorted in a police squad car, they arrived at the lab around the time the plane carrying the president's body took off for Washington from nearby Love Field. The film was viewed for the first time. When the final shot occurred, a loud collective gasp filled the room. Zapruder made 3 copies of the film and delivered 2 of the prints to the Secret Service. He agreed to sell the rights of the film to Life magazine for $150,000. In 2013, that's more than $1 million. He donated $25,000 of the proceeds to the widow of slain Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit. In the agreement with Life magazine, Zapruder asked that Life refrain from showing the most graphic images from the film. He did not want to offend the Kennedy family. The general public would not see the fatal headshot until a dozen years later. In 1975, ABC News reporter Geraldo Rivera obtained a copy of the film and convinced network executives to show it on his weekly talk show, Good Night America. The showing of the film caused a national sensation, fueling conspiracy theories. In 1991, the controversy continued when director Oliver Stone used the Zapruder film extensively in the movie JFK. In 1999, the Justice Department gave $16 million plus interest to the Zapruder family as compensation for the government's forced acquisition of the film. The Zapruder family has since donated copies of the film and related items, along with the copyright, to the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza.
All right, so a little bit of the backstory behind the film. So you've probably seen it before, at least excerpts of it. And again, just because it's so widely known, because it's readily available, because I thought we'd spend our time looking at other stuff, and because it's very graphic, and out of respect to the Kennedy family, have chosen not to show it. So then after the shooting, here is Secret Service agent Clint Hill. He ran from the car behind and jumped into the Kennedy's car to protect them, which was in itself a miraculous feat because he had to run from the car behind to catch up to this one. He's written a book about his career, Clint Hill, the Secret Service officer. And then here's some pictures from the aftermath. People ducking and racing. As you can imagine, it took a long time, or at least a while, for people to kind of figure out what's going on. Now, if you're in Dallas area or going to be visiting, you should check out this museum. It's called the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza. We were just there yesterday and then again this morning, and we've been there before. So if you get a chance, you come check this out. It's very interesting to see. You can look out the window. They have a lot of historical exhibits. Also really noteworthy to kind of walk around the area and see the different aspects of the assassination site. There is an X in the street marking the exact spot where the fatal shot was fired, striking the president. And then there's also a memorial, a short walk away from Dealey Plaza, that was designed by Philip Johnson, famous American architect. You can go stop and see that as well. And so this is a picture of the Philip Johnson Memorial. And then someone brought it up. I don't remember who it was. Oh, I think it was maybe Beverly. So what happened to the car? Well, they actually used it for a while after the death of President Kennedy, which is kind of eerie. But it now resides in the Henry Ford Museum, which is in my hometown of Dearborn, Michigan. So I'm originally from Dearborn, Michigan. Dearborn is a suburb of Detroit. So if you want to see the car, it's on display there. And then I thought I would show some photos of the aftermath. These are very interesting and moving and eerie and fascinating. So look at these people are glancing over in the car. So the car pulled up. Everyone, of course, immediately exited. And the roses were left behind in the back seat. So very stark photo. And then here's where the car has been pulled up. Here's the hospital. So this is at Parkland Hospital. Here's the authorities trying to kind of keep everybody in control. Everyone's wondering what's going on. People trying to figure out what's going on, and you have to remember how slowly news would have traveled back at this point in time, in an era before the 24-hour news cycle and cell phones and the internet and all that kind of stuff. And people know something bad has happened, but they don't know the full extent. At this point in time, people just know outside the hospital that President Kennedy was brought here and he was shot. That's the extent of that they know. And people are praying and keeping hope alive. You can tell the pictures that were taken before it was announced that the president had died and after, and I'll show you why in a minute. So you can tell these pictures were taken before it was announced that President Kennedy was, just because people have a very concerned look on their face. The pictures that were taken after the announcement that he died are very, very different. I'll show you some of those in just a moment. Now, before it was officially announced that President Kennedy had died, again, you kind of have to remember that no one really knew what was going on. If you kind of, maybe a parallel would be to 9/11. For the first few minutes and hours of 9/11, it took a while to kind of process what had actually taken place or what was going on. So at this point in time, no one really knows what's going on. And so the thought was, because of security, that they should get Johnson out of here. So Lyndon Johnson was actually moved out of the hospital before it was officially announced that President Kennedy had died. I think it just took place just a few minutes before the official announcement was made. So here's Lyndon Johnson. He's being taken to Love Field. So they know inside the hospital that Kennedy has died, but they haven't told people on the outside that just yet. But then they set up for the news, and the White House team and the medical team there at the hospital came out and announced that the president had died. Now, they don't have the satellite news feed technology. So like, this wasn't broadcast on live television like it would be done today. And so they're making the announcement of what's taken place. And again, here's our timeline. So President Kennedy was shot at 12:30. The limousine took 6 minutes to get from there to Parkland Hospital, arrived at 12:36. It was pretty quickly at 12:40 that Walter Cronkite first announced that the president had been shot. I'll actually play a video clip of that in just a moment. At 1:26, Lyndon Johnson departed the hospital. And then 4 minutes later, they actually officially announced that he had died. President Kennedy had died. So interesting that they got Johnson out of there a few minutes before they made the announcement, or they didn't make the announcement until they had gotten Johnson out of the area, so to speak. I'll have a few more noteworthy dates to fill in the rest of the slide, and I'll show you that a little bit later. And you can see at this point in time, okay, it's been announced that the president has died, because people are weeping and crying and carrying on. There's a lot of photos like this. You can just tell that people, just a lot more emotion taking place. So these photos were after it was announced that President Kennedy, the kind of the hope that he would be okay has vanished, because it's been announced that he's died. And then Robert Kennedy was actually at home in Virginia when he first got word that his brother had been shot. And then he was outside with some of his children when word finally got to him that not only was the brother shot, that he had been killed. And so this is a very touching photo. This is this is Robert Kennedy with two of his children, comforting them after he's just received the news that his brother has been killed. And this is at his home in Virginia. He was not with the president at that point in time. And then famously, Walter Cronkite announced to the world what had been taking place in Dallas. And so this is how a lot of people actually found out about how President Kennedy had been killed. If you actually know anyone that was alive back then, like my mom and dad are still alive, you should ask them what their memories were, how they found out about the shooting and the death of President Kennedy. You usually get a lot of interesting. The dean of American media personalities, the veteran Walter Cronkite, you could hear him cracking up his voice as he was announcing the death of President Kennedy. So I remember back to this photo that we showed earlier John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy exiting the Air Force One at Love Field in Dallas, and then you contrast that with these other two photos. So this is the casket bearing the body of President Kennedy being put on board Air Force One. There was a little bit of a scuffle between the local authorities in Dallas and the Secret Service. The local authorities did not want to release President Kennedy's body to the Secret Service to take back to Washington. So there was a debate going back and forth on what should they do and what was the protocol going to be and how was this process going to work. And then Jacqueline said that she was not going to leave the hospital unless she was with her husband's body. And then Lyndon Johnson said that, well, he's not going to leave unless Jackie leaves. And so there's just all this going back and forth. And then I think the Secret Service kind of leveraged their way to getting a hold of the body and taking it away. But this was kind of a contentious moment for a while and a little bit controversial. But that being said, I've always thought this photo was extremely sad, given the context of, remember this one, which was this really happy moment of them getting off the plane just a short time earlier. And then here they are putting President Kennedy's body in, they put it in a coffin and they're carrying it up to Air Force One. And then look at this photo of poor Jackie. She's having to go up the stairs all by herself. You can see the blood spattered on her suit. And, you know, she's having to walk up the stairs by herself. And so just to me, this really incredible series of three photos, the contrast between the happiness of the one on the top and the sorrow and loneliness and etc. The ones on the bottom, just very striking. All right, let's talk about a little bit of the aftermath. So this is a famous photo. This is Lyndon Johnson taking the oath of office. You can see Lady Bird Johnson is behind him. Here's Jacqueline over here. So this was just a little bit more than a couple hours after the shooting. This famous photo is taken. You can see Jacqueline here, obviously very emotional. So it was decided that Lyndon Johnson should take the oath of office at the plane because they thought this would be a more secure area over at the airport, and it was decided that he would take the oath of office before that plane actually took off, just to be on the safe side. Again, they're not quite sure what's going on. They don't know if this is part of a broader conspiracy or something else. Here's a colorized version of that photo. And then here's the Johnsons trying to comfort Jackie. And again, this is a very raw photo. This is just a couple hours after President Kennedy had been shot, and surely everyone was still processing what was going on. Okay, we're in the home stretch of our program. I just wanted to include a little bit more context. So you have to think about after Lyndon Johnson took the oath of office, he really had to assume the power of the nation and kind of move forward. So here's a picture of him in Air Force One, already trying to get a grip on things and issue orders and start planning the transition. And the plane flees Dallas and heads back to Washington, D.C. If you want to see the Air Force One that was used in this particular series of events, it's on display at a really great museum, the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. And then here's some more photos. So this is them. The plane has landed back at Andrews outside of Washington, D.C., and they're taking the casket off of the plane. And then here's Jackie. So as soon as the plane landed, Robert Kennedy rushed on board, and he was very adamant that he didn't want Jackie to have to exit the plane by herself. Remember, there was that photo of her going onto the plane by herself, and he didn't see that photo, of course, but he rushed to the plane, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, if he wasn't the first one on board the plane, he was one of the first people, and he met up with Jackie and made sure that she came off accompanied by him. And there's another photo. You can see the blood on her suit. And what they're doing is they're waiting for their turn to get off the plane. They're sticking the casket of President Kennedy in the car. And then this was the timeline that I put up earlier. So if you want to take a screenshot of this or a picture with your phone, so let's go through this real quickly. 11:38, Air Force One landed at Love Field in Dallas. 11:52, the presidential motorcade departed, and then approximately 12:30 was when President Kennedy was shot. The limousine reached Parkland Hospital 6 minutes later. 4 minutes after that, Walter Cronkite made that first announcement that President Kennedy had been shot. That wasn't the announcement that President Kennedy had been killed. That was, of course, just the one that he had announced that he had been shot. And then Lyndon Johnson departed the hospital. The doctors announced President Kennedy was dead at 1:30. And then 20 minutes after that, Lee Harvey Oswald was captured. President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy departed Parkland Hospital at 2:08. So you can see they weren't there for very long. The hospital, the Kennedys arrived at the hospital at 12:36, and at 2:08 they departed. And then at 2:38 is when Lyndon Johnson was sworn in. And so that was 128 minutes after President Kennedy had been shot, and 68 minutes after it had been announced publicly that he had died. And then a short time thereafter, Air Force One departed Love Field at 2:47. And then at 5:58 Eastern Standard Time, or 4:58 local time, Air Force One lands at Andrews Air Force Base, which is the Air Force base outside of Washington, D.C., that the president and many other people use. And so there you go. So again, if you want to take a screenshot of that or a picture with your phone, and of course, this is big news throughout the world, particularly in the United States. If you're interested in media history, it's very fascinating to go back and read like newspaper accounts of the Kennedy assassination, particularly since early on they didn't have all the information of what had taken place. So here's some more headlines from the New York Times and the Washington Post. Here's that famous photo. Commuters on their way home. And of course, there was a lot of magazine coverage. I met a gentleman who actually worked for President Kennedy, and I wanted to include this image because he told me that he thought this was the best, most realistic likeness of President Kennedy. This was an image that was done by Norman Rockwell. They put this on their October 29th, 1960 cover, and then they reused it when they made this tribute publication after the assassination. President Kennedy was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald. And Oswald, after he fled the book depository, he made his way to the Oak Cliff section of Dallas, if you're familiar with that area. And there was a bulletin put out to be on the lookout for a person with a description of Oswald. And so Officer J.D. Tippett of the Dallas Police Department saw a gentleman who fit the description or matched the description of this person that had been subject to this police announcement. And so he pulls his car over and instructs Oswald to stop. And then Tippett gets out of his car and Oswald shot him with a pistol, killing Tippett. And then Oswald fled. Kennedy wasn't the only person to get killed that day. Dallas police officer J.D. Tippett died in the line of duty trying to apprehend Oswald. And then Oswald fled to a movie theater, and witnesses had seen him running in there. And so the police go in there and they apprehend him. He put up a struggle before he was finally apprehended. You can see him. He's very emotional here. And then a short time thereafter, Jack Ruby shot Oswald in this famous Pulitzer Prize winning photo. So there was no trial. And again, we talked about the fact that the Kennedys were the first modern president and first lady just because of all the media coverage, like the debate and the inauguration and the White House tour and the assassination and even the funeral. So this is just a few images. We're in the home stretch for a program. President Kennedy's body lay in state in the Capitol in Washington, D.C., the United States Capitol. And there was, you can imagine, very extensive media coverage. I don't know of any event that had received this much media coverage up till this point in time in history. Just television and radio and magazines, and the whole country pretty much shut down until after the funeral was over on Monday. So for the weekend, John F. Kennedy was shot on Friday. The official funeral took place on Monday. And so for that whole weekend, if you talk to people that were alive back then, most of the businesses and stuff were all closed. Here's Jackie and her daughter at the casket in the Capitol. And here they are leaving the Capitol. So you've perhaps seen some of these photos before. And here's President Kennedy's body being taken down the streets of Washington, D.C. Here it is departing the White House. The delegation walked from the White House to a church a few blocks away for the funeral. And a very touching photo. Mrs. Kennedy flanked by the president's brothers, Robert and Ted. And then this is outside the church. So if you've seen this photo before, this is actually the church is just a few blocks away from the White House where this famous photo of John Jr. saluting was taken. And again, another iconic Kennedy image. And then in Washington, D.C., sometimes people say, where's the Kennedy Memorial? You know, like there's the Lincoln Memorial and a Roosevelt Memorial and the Martin Luther King Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial and the Washington. They say, where's the Kennedy Memorial? Well, the Kennedy Center is the official memorial to John F. Kennedy. It's a living memorial. So the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts is the President Kennedy Memorial. And it's one of the world's fabulous performing arts venues. So if you get a chance, make sure you check that out. One of my favorite places. The Kennedy Center was supposed to be called the Washington, D.C. Performing Arts Center. It was a project that had been kind of stalled. And then when the Kennedys moved into the White House, they were big arts lovers, and they used their influence and powers of persuasion to kind of get the ball rolling, so to speak, on the Kennedy Center. And so again, initially this was supposed to be called the Washington Performing Arts Center, but then after President Kennedy died, because him and Jacqueline had done so much to kind of move this project forward, it was decided that it would be named after him. And then President Kennedy is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Now, John F. Kennedy visited Arlington Cemetery just 11 days before he was killed. He was there for a Veterans Day ceremony, and he was standing on one of the hills that overlooked Washington, D.C. And one of the things that Arlington Cemetery is known for, it has these beautiful views of Washington, D.C. So here's where President Kennedy is buried at, along with Jacqueline Kennedy. And then you can see, if you're not familiar with this view, this is Washington, D.C. here in the background. So Arlington Cemetery has this stunning view of Washington, D.C. When President Kennedy visited there 11 days before he was shot, he said, "This place is so beautiful, I could stay here forever." And so when he died, there was a big debate on what should happen to his body. The Kennedy family was very insistent that he be buried back in Massachusetts. After all, that's where President Kennedy was from. The person who made the decision, though, for him to be buried at Arlington was Jacqueline Kennedy. So the decision really rested with her as the wife of John F. Kennedy. And so she used her powers of persuasion and influence to make sure that John F. Kennedy was buried at Arlington Cemetery as opposed to back in Massachusetts. So a very interesting decision. And this Arlington Cemetery had been a popular kind of tourist attraction before this. But when Jacqueline decided that John F. Kennedy should be buried there, it really kind of took it to a whole another level. So you really have to kind of give her a lot of credit for that. And then again, here's the view. Some pictures from the funeral. And if you go visit the Washington, D.C. area, make sure you check out Arlington National Cemetery, and you can see the gravesite of President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy and two of their children. So this is their daughter, Arabella. She was stillborn. And then this is their son, Patrick. Remember, this is the son that died just 15 weeks before President Kennedy was killed. So Jacqueline Kennedy, in a 15-week span, lost not only her husband, but also her son, Patrick. And really interesting in that video, she talked about the fact that she was so glad that she was there alongside him when he died, even though he was shot and killed, assassinated. She preferred the fact that she was with him at that time, as opposed to him being all by himself, which is very moving. All right, I'm going to play a video of the Kennedy funeral in just a moment. But before I do that, why don't I check in with a couple of our audience members. We have Patty joining us once again. Hi, Patty. Thanks so much for being here. And then we also have Marty joining us. And if you've been listening or watching the comments, Marty is really knowledgeable about a lot of historical things, including the Kennedy assassination. So I'll see if the two of them have any comments they want to share with us. If they're not available, that's fine. But if they do have anything they want to share, we'll check in with them and see. So we'll start off with you, Patty. Patty, anything you want to share? This one challenge with doing a presentation on this topic, it's so complex and there's so many facets to it and aspects of it. I'm sure I skipped over things that you and some other people might think that's important, but any particular thing that you wanted to comment on or add or interject? I'll start with you, Patty, and then I'll check in with you, Marty, and see if you have anything.
Well, yeah, that comment about being glad she was there was particularly poignant because she had obviously had a great deal of depression after Patrick died, and ended up her sister Lee Radziwill was friendly with Aristotle Onassis, and she ended up being invited to stay on his yacht for some time, and stayed there for quite a while, so had only recently really returned, and still wasn't super excited about going on a campaign trip, but was talked into it. And so yeah, it was very that it was very poignant that she realized that she, could have chosen not to be there. So she was really grateful. The other thing that concerns me is I have seen a little bit in the comments certain I don't know, comments about lapses or unexplained this or that, and this is one of the early experiences where all these conspiracy theories started, and a lot more is known and understood about this than some of these comments would indicate. So I don't know, misinformation and disinformation is proving so dangerous to this country that I really encourage people to not engage in it, because it doesn't really accomplish anything. And if you really
No, Patty, hold that thought, if you don't mind. The reason I say that is not to cut you off, sorry, but I'm going to play a video at the end that talks about the conspiracy theories. And I guess I started out the program saying I don't believe in the conspiracy theories, but if someone does, that's totally fine. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, and we try and be an organization that's open to people's ideas, whatever they are. So hold the thought on on that topic, because I'm going to play a video that addresses that in just a little bit. So hold that thought. What about anything that you think, as far as like the assassination, that you wanted to add or interject, that
Yeah.
maybe we didn't get a chance to cover, or that you think is particularly interesting, or anything like that?
The commentator that talked about it being the end of innocence. I mean, it had been a long stretch post World War II where we felt we were on a constantly upward trajectory. And there were, like that during that period, there was the McCarthy red baiting issues. There also was the birth of the John Birch Society. But so there were some undercurrents, but generally speaking, there had been a long period of idealism, and a lot of veterans of World War II had had the opportunity to go to schools of various types, help with building homes and that sort of thing. And this just, I mean, it was utterly shocking. I was in a math class when the announcement came over, and it was just total shock. I mean, shock that you can't even describe. On one level, it's like, this can't even be true. On the other level, your stomach is dropping, through your down to your feet. And it just was shocking. And they ended up, I think for a short time, everybody was kind of milling around trying to decide what to do. People were crying. And at a certain point, they just decided to just send everybody home. But that took a certain amount of time because it was outside of the regular bus schedule and all that sort of thing. So it was just a really disorienting time. And I can remember on the school bus, it was so quiet. And anybody who's ever been on a school bus knows that school buses are never quiet.
Except for that time.
What's that?
Except for that time.
Yeah, it was just really strange. And then the other thing was that the following Sunday when Oswald was shot, I was at church and we came home to that announcement. So fortunately, we weren't watching TV when it happened. I've always been grateful for that. But
okay,
it was just so shocking that somebody could actually be shot on camera in a police station. It was really kind of insane. So it was an extremely emotional time. And I think that's a good summation, is that the end of innocence,
Okay, no problem. What about, let's check in with hi Marty, how are you doing? Are you there with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can. Thanks so much for sharing all your insights and perspectives on today's topic. I thought if you don't mind, any particular thing that you think I didn't get a chance to cover that you think's important, or any particular aspects of the event that you find particularly fascinating?
Well, as a native Dallasite, it's been just the shame that was put upon Dallas just because a fellow lived here, was renting here. He was not a Dallasite. It just was very hard for us to live down. I think the important, or one of the things that, another twist of irony of history, is that the parade motorcade had been expanded, I believe, the night before and published in all the Dallas papers. They wanted more streets in downtown Dallas to have people along them, which really had, the problem with that, as it turned out, was that the new route had them coming down a street called Houston Street, which is now in front of Dealey Plaza. And then it made that left onto the Elm Street, the triple underpass. Had they not expanded that parade route, it would have come straight down Elm Street, and Oswald would not have had as much time to figure out who's sitting where and gauge the speed and all that. Would it have still happened? He was going to get somebody. He may not have been able to get the 3 shots off. Who knows? But that's always been a real sad fact. And the other thing that's interesting, of course, there's all kinds of stuff, and I totally concur with you. Don't get into the minutia and trying to, figure out what really went on. We may never, ever know. But one interesting commentary I heard that is interesting to note, that Lee Harvey Oswald had a dishonorable discharge from the Marine Corps, and that dishonorable discharge was signed by John Connolly. And Marina Oswald testified when they got her on the stand that Oswald had nothing. He had voted for Kennedy. He didn't have much of anything against Kennedy, but he hated John Connally because he couldn't get any jobs with that dishonorable discharge.
Oh, I see. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that part of the story. Wow. What about when, so there's a lot of people joining us from outside of Dallas that have probably never been to this site before. Any particular thing that you find interesting about this? Like, to me, I grew up in Detroit, and it's just really fascinating to read about this event and see the video, and then actually come down here and walk around this place in person and just see how things unfolded. And you can see the view that Oswald had and the route the motorcade. But I guess for people that maybe haven't been to the site, any particular thing kind of stand out you as a local Dallas person?
Yes, I appreciate that they've kept it fair, and they've kept it as uncommercial as it could be kept. The Dallas,
there's no Starbucks right in the middle of everything.
or any, it's, you walk around and you sense the gravity from the first, the seriousness of what happened there from the first. The interesting thing is, less than a month ago, Dallas voted to refurbish and update the Dealey Plaza, and I tell you, I don't know what they're going to do, but I personally like it kept really substantially the way it was the day the tragedy happened.
Okay, yeah, I guess we'll have to see what the plans are in store. So, well, thanks, Marty. I really appreciate you joining us and sharing your comment. We also have another guest. We have David Moore joining us. Hi, David. How are you doing? Can you hear me okay? Oh, maybe we lost David. Let me check back in with him. David, I wasn't sure if you wanted to share anything with our group or not. If you do, you're more than welcome to.
Yeah, I agree with
Hi,
Marty.
David. How you doing? Good to see you again.
Yeah, same here. It's been a while.
Yeah. So I guess same two questions for you. Any particular thing that you feel like I didn't really get a chance to go over as far as the facts of the assassination, or any particular thing about the event that you find particularly interesting?
Well, yeah, there was a couple of things. First, I agree with Marty about people hated Dallas for a long time, but when MLK was assassinated in Memphis, nobody hated Memphis. So then Robert Kennedy was assassinated in '68 in LA, but nobody hated LA. Oswald wasn't from Dallas. We're not a city of hate, and that still kind of hurts my sense of pride. But yeah, there was a couple of things regarding the roof. I can't remember where I read this, but it was built in Cincinnati by the Secret Service with their specifications. And according to what I read anyway, they said that the high-powered rifle wouldn't have stopped a bullet on that particular roof. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I don't know if I necessarily believe that or not. So, but anyway, that's what I read
There it
about
is.
it.
Yeah. Sometimes I could, bullet. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
not, that's a good point. It's not necessarily bulletproof glass, although sometimes when a bullet goes through glass, it can change the trajectory or lessen
Exactly.
the velocity of it, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yeah. But it was interesting. I got to see a couple of pictures that I haven't seen before. The one where Robert Kennedy was hugging his kids, I had never seen that before. And a couple of things on the plane when LBJ was being sworn in. A guy named Jack Valenti. If you look to the lower left, he's looking right at the camera. And
Oh, hold on. I'll pull that photo up there with me.
Yeah.
For a moment. Hold on, almost there. Okay, this one.
Yeah, see the guy looking right at the camera to the left of the guy standing in the bow tie?
Yep, right here.
That's Jack Valenti.
Oh
And,
my.
yeah,
It
sure
is. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh.
So tell people that may not be familiar with who is he?
He, Marty or somebody
Marty.
might know better, but just I just remembered his name. I think he used to be an actor, but I know for a long time he was president of the Screen Actors Guild in LA.
Oh yeah.
So
Wow.
I'm not sure what he was doing on there, but that's him.
He was a close aide to LBJ.
Oh, he was. Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
He ended up working with him in the White House. Yeah.
Oh, he did. Oh, I didn't know that. And also, not in that picture, but you can see Henry Wade, who would later become the DA of Dallas. It's not on that particular picture, but I can see him off to the right in another wider shot. And where is he? I don't.
He's not in there.
Yeah, he's not in
I
there.
guess to me, this is such an amazing photo because think about it. So
It
Jacqueline
is.
Kennedy's husband had just been shot 122 hours and 8 minutes before this
Yeah.
photo. So imagine having to pull yourself together and get in front of this camera and be around all these. I mean, if this would have happened to me, I would have locked myself in my house for 2 days and not gone anywhere. So
Yeah.
just the composure she had to pull herself together and stand there is really incredible.
Mhm. Well, my dad told me that she was such a pillar of strength. People didn't know her personally. They thought she was a little, not exactly very deep person. She was more concerned with what she looked like, but she was so so powerful and so strong, and really kept up really well considering the circumstances, I think.
Yeah, she had a lot more substance than people give her
Yes,
credit
exactly.
for. Now, what about David?
Yeah.
You were telling us yesterday at the museum you have an interesting personal connection to the Kennedy assassination. Would you mind sharing your brief story about that?
No, I don't mind at all. My dad was in the Democratic Party, and he was waiting at the Trade Mart for a luncheon that JFK obviously didn't make. But he said there's like 2,500 people there, and it was bipartisan because Kennedy wanted to heal some wounds between the Democratic and Republican Party. Nixon won Dallas County by about 70 to 30%. So my dad knew John Connally, and he knew Ben Barnes real well, who was the lieutenant governor of Texas. And it really had an impact on us. I remember when he came home, of course, I was only 5. I remember him coming home from the assassination, or coming home from the Trade Mart. And he was just in a state of shock, and my mom was pregnant. And that was the very first time I had seen her cry, and that really bothered me, even though, I was just a little kid, but still, it really bothered me to see both my parents express emotion, especially intense grief for the first time in my life.
Oh, wow. What about you, Marty? Any family connections with you in the day's events?
No, I have a gal from my class at the local high school was John Connally, or is John Connally's niece, excuse me. But no, just remembrances of the minister who was to deliver the opening prayer for that Trade Mart luncheon. It was Herbert Howard of Park Cities Baptist, and they kept wiring him, telling him, just wait just a minute, hold off, we don't have the speaker yet. And I think they were, as I heard it, they were among the last to know. And instead of Dr. Howard giving we thank you for whatever, all our blessings, he had to basically give a eulogy. And I heard there was not a dry eye in that room. And it was mostly men, of course, at that time.
Right. Yeah, it was actually Dr. Luther Holcomb who,
I didn't. Okay.
Yeah, that actually announced that. And the person that announced that Kennedy had been shot is J.R. Johnson, who the library in downtown Dallas is named after.
Someone asked if who was the person who was doing the radio announcing when the Kennedys landed. I don't know who that is.
It wasn't Vest Fox at CBS, that I can tell you. So it must have been ABC or NBC. Do you know?
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure who that was.
I'm not sure. It's probably somebody with KRLD radio.
No, that's CBS. Oh, maybe so. I think Vest Fox was CBS radio. So I think it's ABC or NBC.
Oh, okay. I'll have to do some research because someone had inquired about it. If you go to the 6th floor museum, they actually are playing that clip, but I just thought it was really eerie to listen to that, as knowing it's funny. He says in the comment, "Oh, you can see President suntan all the way from here."
Yeah.
And Jackie looking very radiant.
Nobody knew.
Yeah,
I will say though, I avoided intentionally going to the 6th floor museum because of the shame that we all, saying that we felt for being in the wrong city at the wrong time. But I'll tell you, when I finally went there, I think they have done a marvelous job. I think it's it's not sensationalism. I think it's well worth the entry fee and spending an hour and a half to 2 hours in there, because you can actually stand, as you know, you can stand at that window. That is really spooky.
Yep.
And I just think it's very well done.
Oh yeah. Well, they make a big point at so if you haven't been in the museum before, you should come check it out. But the museum makes a big point that they don't focus solely on the assassination. They want to make sure they also talk about the life of President Kennedy and then also his legacy. And then they also have a lot of other historical exhibits, like now they're having one on the civil rights movement. So it is a very worthwhile site to go see if you get a chance. What about, so I have a couple more short videos to play, but before I do, just real quick, Patty, any final thoughts before, because we're getting ready to wrap things up. Any quick final thoughts before we continue on? And then I'll ask the same with David and Marty.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that this is still so emotional. You know, all these years later, of course, we have not had a similar event on the presidential level, although we did have a president who resigned in the meantime. I arrived at this program having just watched the play Kennedy, Bobby's Last Crusade, and so it's been an extremely emotional evening for me. It's sort of like reliving the most idealistic years of my life that kept being rained on, you know what I mean? It was like, I do intensely remember that, because again, remember that in between Jack and Bobby, there was also Martin Luther King, and there was that song, Abraham, Martin, and John, that affected, I mean, I could never hear that song without crying. So it was definitely a very moving time, and that I don't really have anything to add. It's very interesting listening to people who are residents of Dallas, because I at that time lived in Massachusetts, so JFK was Massachusetts, if you know what I'm saying. So two interesting, you know, completely different perspectives on it, and yet it happened to all of us, right, all at the same time. So
yeah, group event. So, okay, well, thanks, Patty. What about David? Any final thoughts for you before we go back to our videos?
Yes, just a little bit of self-promotion, but on emuseum.jfk.org, there's several different interviews, and one of them is Walter Cronkite. So if you guys ever get a chance to go to that website, it's emuseum.jfk.org, and go under oral collections. And Walter Cronkite is the very first one that was interviewed. And they've also got Tom Brokaw and Peter Jennings, among other people that are in that. So there's some real interesting interviews to watch.
And they have another interesting interview on there as well. Who's that person?
I think it's me.
You're in great company there with Walter Cronkite.
I know, it's amazing.
So if you're watching this program live on Zoom, I'll email out the link for David's interview. He talks about his kind of personal connection and goes into more detail. But yeah, if you're watching this live, I'll be happy to email the link along with the recording for this program. If you're watching the YouTube on this at some point in time in the future, just go to the 6th Floor Museum website and go under the oral histories, and you can Mr. David Moore's interview along with Walter Cronkite's, if you're also interested in what he had to say. Well, thanks, David. What about Marty? Any final thoughts before we continue on?
Well, I'm going to arc back to Patty's last comment about it happened to us all, because my parents were, as I've written, were not happy with JFK's election at all. And they were even more unhappier with LBJ succeeding him. But I will say one thing, that my dad was downtown. He said he had seen Kennedy's hand go by on the motorcade. When he got home, he cried. And I had only seen my dad cry when his mother died. That was the second time.
Oh, wow.
And Dad said, I did not vote for John Kennedy, but he was elected our president. He was our president. And this is a free country with nobody has the right to murder an elected official.
Okay, well, that's excellent. Well, thank you. Thanks all of you. Thanks, Patty. Thanks, David, and thanks, Marty, for sharing this. So I do have 2 more videos to show you. So let me go ahead and cue those up. So when we finished last, we were talking about the funeral. So I thought you might find this interesting because I thought it was very moving. So this is actually a video we're going to be playing from the funeral. So let me go ahead and cue this up. So we got 2 more videos to play, and then we'll call it a night. So, oops, hold on one second. All right. So this is video footage of the actual funeral of President Kennedy. You'll notice the person who plays taps got a little overcome by emotion. You'll see what I mean in just a moment. You can see the video footage back then wasn't the quality that it is now. So let's see. So that's the most of our program. We were talking about the Kennedy assassination. Of course, it's the 59th anniversary. Let's see. We'll skip over that. Just wanted to mention John F. Kennedy. Historians on the C-SPAN poll ranked him our 8th best president in history. And then I wanted to read this quote from Jacqueline Kennedy. You might be familiar with the term Camelot, and that actually originated with Jacqueline Kennedy. She said in an interview, President Kennedy was strongly attracted to Camelot because he was an idealist who saw history as something made by heroes like King Arthur. At night, before we'd go to sleep, Jack liked to play some records, and the song he loved the most came at the very end of this record, The Last Side of Camelot, where the song goes, don't let it be forgot. For once there was a spot, for one brief shining moment that was known as Camelot. And then she goes on to say, there will be great presidents again, but there will never be another Camelot. So Jacqueline Kennedy actually originated the term Camelot in association with the Kennedy administration. And of course, this is we're coming up, it's actually Tuesday, is the 29th anniversary of the death of President Kennedy. So thanks so much for joining us. I did want to play a short video if you're interested. That's the official end of our program, but there's a lot of different opinions on what happened with President Kennedy. And so I said at the start of our program, I personally don't believe in the conspiracy theories. If you do, that's totally fine. I'm a big believer in everyone is entitled to their own opinion and can form their own conclusions. And it is a very unusual case in the sense that there's a lot of questionable things that took place and mysterious circumstances and et cetera, et cetera. So I guess my thought is always just to kind of lay out the facts as I see them and let people really form their own conclusions. And for this particular topic, I really encourage you to go research this case more and learn about it. And we only really had the chance to kind of scratch the surface, so to speak. But I did want to play a video. It's from Vincent Bugliosi. He was the gentleman who wrote the book Helter Skelter. He was the prosecutor of Charles Manson and the Manson family. He's former Los Angeles prosecutor, and he talked extensively about the Kennedy assassination and the subsequent investigation. He wrote articles and a book about it. And so I wanted to play a clip from a video interview that he did, giving his thoughts on the Kennedy assassination. And I personally agree with what he has to say. If you don't agree with them, again, that's totally fine. You're entitled to have your own opinion. We're people, not all of us are going to agree on things, and it's a free country. So that's it. But that being said, I just wanted to play just so you can hear kind of his perspective on his thoughts, because it's a very controversial topic, and again, it has a lot of facets. But hopefully today's program inspire you to kind of learn more about President Kennedy and his life and his legacy, and then also just kind of the different facets of the assassination. But again, this is Vincent Bugliosi. He was the former Los Angeles district attorney. He was the gentleman who prosecuted Charles Manson, the Manson family, and wrote the book Helter Skelter. He studied this case extensively, and this was his opinion on the Kennedy assassination.
Robert, before you run that, most of us did not see that first video. I'm not sure what happened. A lot of
really? Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Let me go back and check. Let me do it again. Thanks, Patty. I appreciate that. Let me. That's strange because it's all set up and ready to go. Well, you know what? I'll queue this up, and if you can see it, great. If you can't see it, well, here, let me do this. Let me stop share. Thanks, Patty. I appreciate that. Hold on for 1 second. Okay, I hit refresh. Let's see if this takes care of things.